Hey everybody, welcome to the year 2021. We've successfully made our way through the year 2020. It's over, it's done with. Happy New Year and welcome to the rest of your lives. Hopefully 2021 goes a little bit better for us than 2020 did. All we can do is hope at this point. Anyway, so to that end, today we're discussing the very foundation of what this channel is all about, and that is hosting your own Rust server. So for some of you that have been watching my channel for quite some time, this is going to be a bit of recap for you guys. If you watch this entire video, even though this information isn't necessarily useful to you, I appreciate that very much. But for those of you that are brand new to the channel, this is what we do on this channel. I'm going to start you off at the very foundation of what it is that we need to do, and that is to get your Rust server up and running for yourself. I'm going to show you every step required. I'm going to explain as much of it as I can along the way, and I also hope to inject a couple of solutions to the problems that I know that other viewers have had in the past. So if you want to have your own Rust server, watch the rest of this video. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome to Rust Admin Academy, where I teach you guys the very best tips and tricks to owning and operating a successful Rust server. On this channel, I do a lot of plugin reviews and tutorials to hopefully show you some of the different cool things that you can do with your server to help increase the quality of life or the gameplay for your players. So if you're brand new to the channel, of course, consider subscribing so that you stay up to date on everything that we're working on. And as always, the best way to help me out with this channel is just to simply give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful for you. All right, so let's get into starting our very own Rust server from the ground up. So like I said before, yes, I have done this video in the past. In fact, this is going to be the third edition of this very same video. If you'd like to watch the video that I made for the year 2020, I'll put a link to it in the top right hand corner right now. I will be going over a lot of the same stuff that's in that video. I'm just going to be adding in a couple of the details that might have been missed on that video, and definitely some questions that have come up since then. So I guess one of the most important questions you need to ask yourself is, do you want to actually pay somebody to host your server, or do you want to just host it on your own local network? Paying a hosting server, we're going to get into that in another video because I definitely want to cover that information for you guys because it does change things up quite a bit. However, if you are planning on hosting this server on your own local network, which doesn't necessarily mean that you're hosting it on the computer that you're playing on, it just means that you're hosting it on a computer that resides within your network. So I've seen people host servers on old laptops, just something that's been kicking around, something that powers up, but it does need to have a decent amount of RAM and it needs to have a decent internet connection. So I don't suggest doing this on Wi-Fi. I definitely want you to have a hardline connection. And more importantly, your players are going to want your server to have a hardline connection. I've seen people try and operate servers on Wi-Fi. Not a really good idea. I mean, if it's just for you or maybe a couple of your friends or whatever to join the server, then maybe it's not so important. But if you want the general public to be able to join your server and actually have a good playing experience, you want to have a good internet connection. And being that the computer that you're going to be hosting the server on doesn't even necessarily need to have a graphics output, you don't necessarily have to have a big monster machine to host your server. You just need to have a decent amount of RAM and a decent internet connection. And then what I would suggest you do, if you don't have an internet connection readily available, you can just simply put this laptop right next to your router or your modem, plug it in directly, and then just remote desktop into it. If remote desktop protocol is something that you guys might be interested in doing, make sure you leave me a comment in the comment section down below, and I'll be sure to do a video on exactly how to do that. In fact, what you're seeing on my screen right now is in fact that. What you're seeing, this desktop that's right here, is a computer that's downstairs right next to my router. It doesn't even have a monitor, a keyboard, or a mouse hooked up to it. It's literally just a tower sitting next to my router with an Ethernet cable plugged directly into it. That's it. Whenever I need to have access to it, I just use remote desktop protocol or RDP to log into the computer just like I would as if it were sitting right in front of me. But the benefit to doing it this way is none of the resources required to run the server are actually taking away from my gameplay. If I'm not being perfectly clear on that, make sure you start a conversation down below in the comment sections. I'd be more than happy to go back and forth and discuss why I feel that this is a better solution than actually hosting it on the same computer that you're playing on. All of that being said was basically just to describe the difference between a hosted server and a locally hosted server. Anytime I get any type of question, that's usually my first question is this a locally hosted server or are you paying a hosting service? And all that does is help me decide which path I'm going to go down as far as supporting you in the questions that you're asking. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to set up a folder where everything is going to reside, our Rust server as well as SteamCMD. If you're not familiar with what SteamCMD is, don't worry, we're going to get into that in just a second. Just know that it is the infrastructure that allows us to host our own server. So for me, and just for demonstration purposes, and feel free to do this yourself as well, I'm just going to host this server in my actual local C drive. All right, so let's just go into C drive. Let's start a new folder. And for testing purposes, we're just going to call this, as you can see there, I already have another server because I've been using this computer for test servers for years now. I'm just going to call this folder Rust 2021. Now, this is where we start getting into the important detail. Whatever name you name this folder, you want to make sure that you don't have any spaces in it. So this will not work. I would say roughly about 80% of the problems that I have with people that are struggling to get their Rust server up and running is that they have spaces in their folder names. So that's going to be my first tip, is make sure you don't have any spaces in any of your folder names going forward. So we've got a folder called Rust 2021 with no spaces. And here we are, we have our blank folder. So inside this folder, we're going to create another 2 folders. One of them is called SteamCMD, and that looks just like that. The other folder is going to be where our actual server is hosted. So we can call this folder Rust server, again, with no spaces in that name. Now that we have our folder all set up, the next thing we have to do is we need to go get SteamCMD. So just open up your favorite browser and search for SteamCMD, no spaces, doesn't matter. The first thing that comes up is SteamCMD Valve Development Community. We're going to click on that, and that's going to take you to the Valve Development Community. And the first link there is SteamCMD for Windows. You can also download it for Linux or Mac OS. I have exactly 0 experience with hosting on Linux or Mac OS systems, so I'm very comfortable with the Windows environment, which is where we're going to go today. So we're going to click on Windows, and then we're going to click on this download link right here. And of course, that's going to download a zip file into our downloads folder, which will look just like this. So we can right click on our zip folder and we want to extract this folder, but we want to tell it where to extract to. So we're going to click on the one with the 3 dots. We're going to tell it which location to extract to. That is C drive and Rust server 2021. And then we want to extract it into the SteamCMD folder that we had just created a minute ago. And then we can go ahead and click on OK, and then click on OK. And now we have another folder inside of our SteamCMD folder called SteamCMD. So we can double click on that, and then we have a single executable file inside that folder. We can just go ahead and run that file. And what this is going to do is it's going to install the framework for SteamCMD to be used on this computer. And depending on your internet connection, this might take a couple of seconds, it might take a couple of minutes, but just wait for it to finish. And once it's done installing, it's going to look exactly like this. Your cursor is going to be right next to a Steam prompt. That's it, you're done. You can type exit, or you can just X out of the program itself. Now you can see things look a little bit differently in that very same folder that we just ran that executable file from. Now this is obviously just the files that SteamCMD requires to operate on your computer. We will be reusing this SteamCMD.exe file in just a couple of minutes. So in the next couple of minutes here, we're going to run SteamCMD, but you're going to see me grab some address information to make things really easy when we're running the commands inside of SteamCMD. So what I do is I just go to the folder that I need the information out of, and then I just click on the location bar at the very top there. And as you can see, it has now highlighted C drive, Rust 2021, SteamCMD, SteamCMD, and I can just copy this information to my clipboard. I use Control C. You can also right mouse click and click on copy. Now that address is copied to my clipboard, and that is important because I'm going to show you how to just quickly paste that in. Therefore, you end up with no mistakes when you're actually telling SteamCMD where to go and where to find files so that there's no mistakes. The first one that's actually important is where our Rust server is going to be installed. So I've now gone into the Rust server folder that we created at the very beginning, and we can click on that location bar again. And as you can see, it's changed a little bit. C: Rust server 2021, and then Rust server. And same thing, so that we have this information, we can copy that to the clipboard, Control C, or right click and then copy. And then we can just paste that in when we need it in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to do that right now. I actually have this now copied to my clipboard so I can utilize this inside of SteamCMD. So let's go back into our SteamCMD folder, and we're actually going to run the executable file SteamCMD.exe. Every time you run SteamCMD, it's going to check for an update. If an update is available, it's going to automatically do that update. And then once it's done, you're going to be left with a command prompt exactly like what you're seeing on the screen right now. So the first thing that we need to do once we have SteamCMD running is actually log into Steam. In order to log in, I suggest that you log in anonymously. So in order to do that, you just do login space anonymous. Now, one of the questions that I quite often get at this stage is, can I use my own SteamCMD login? Yes, you can. However, why would you do that when you can just log in anonymously? You don't require any passwords. And if you have 2FA activated on your Steam account, you would also need to use that 2FA verification every time you logged into Steam. But for what we're doing here, it doesn't have to be your actual Steam login in order to have access to everything that you need. If you were to use your actual Steam login information, you would just, instead of putting anonymous there, you would put in your Steam ID login. It would prompt you for a password. And if you have 2FA 2FA activated, it would ask you for that 2FA authentication code. So yes, it does work. However, this is just way easier. So we're going to log in anonymous. Your Windows firewall might ask you, do you want to allow this program access to the outside world? And yes, of course we do. We're going to click on allow access. Okay, so now we're connected to Steam through our SteamCMD. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to tell SteamCMD to install all of the files that are required in order for us to start a Rust server. So the command for that is force_install_dir. And the dir at the end of that command line is to specify a directory location of where we want these files to go. So you remember a minute ago when I copied that address information of the folder where I want my Rust files to be installed, I copied that to the clipboard. Now I can just click on Control V and it'll put that address directly in there for me. I don't have to worry about making sure that the spelling is correct. I don't have to worry about anything. I know that it was copied directly from the actual address location of that folder. Okay, so now we've successfully told SteamCMD exactly where we want these files to be installed. Now we just need to tell it to actually do the work and install those files. And the command to do that is app_update 258550. The 258550, that is the Rust server files. And once you hit enter, you're going to see SteamCMD start running a bunch of commands. It's going to check for some updates, and then it's finally going to start installing all of those files. And again, depending on your internet connection, this might take a couple of seconds. It might take a couple of minutes. Just wait for it to completely finish everything that it needs to do, and I'll come back and check with you in just a minute. And once it's complete, this is exactly what your screen should look like. So it'll say success, app update 258550 has been fully installed. So at this point, we can either type exit or you can just X out by clicking on the actual X up here. And once that's all completed, you're going to see that your Rust server folder now has a bunch of information in there that wasn't in there before. These are all the files that are required in order to operate a Rust server. And this is where things start getting really interesting. This is where we actually get to start creating our own Rust server exactly how we want it to be. Is that Rust server sitting right in front of us right now? No, it's not there yet. What we need to do is actually start creating the file that we're going to run in order to start our Rust server up. And that file is a batch file, which is just a Windows executable file. No big deal. You don't have to worry about what a batch file is. Just know that when I'm referring to your batch file, it is the file that we're about to start creating right now. So while there are a couple of different ways in order to create a batch file, what I suggest you do first is just start a new text document. It doesn't matter what it is. In fact, we don't even have to name it anything else, but we are going to open that up and we just want to save this file. We want to click on file. We want to click on save as, and let's name this something. So let's call this batch file Rust server startup file. And we want to give it the .bat extension. We want to change this to all files right here. And then we want to click on save. And then we can just close this and we can actually delete the text file that we used to create our batch file with. Okay, so now as you can see there's now a file in there that might look a little bit different than what you're used to seeing before. And it has the .bat extension. And it says over here that it's a Windows batch file, which just means it's a Windows executable file. So now we need to edit this. Now, while you can use Windows Notepad to edit your batch files, I highly suggest that you go and download Notepad++. It gives you the exact same functionality as Notepad. It just makes it a little bit easier to navigate your way around. Just go try Notepad++. You'll see the differences. It's a free download. In fact, I'll put a link to it in the video description down below. So we're going to edit this file with Notepad++. And so now we have a blank document that is called our Rust server startup file.bat. So what information do we actually have to put in this file? Well, there's a lot, and there's a lot of different places where you can get this information. I'll be putting the example that we're going to be starting out with today in the video description down below. So if you want to use my version, just copy it from the video description down below, and you can paste it directly into the batch file that we've now created, that you've now created on your own computer. And once you've pasted that information in there, it's going to look similar to this. In fact, if you've copied it from my video description, it's going to look exactly like this. But there is some important information in here that we need to change before this is actually going to function as we intend it to. There are also some formatting things that I teach on other videos that I've done in the past, so that we can make this batch file a little bit easier to read for the human eye. So a couple of things that I just want to go over first of all. If you ever hear me refer to having a restart loop built into your batch file, that's what these lines right here. So lines 1 and 2 and 5 are part of a restart loop. So if you're finding that your server is automatically restarting and you maybe don't necessarily want it to, it's because this restart loop is built into the batch file. So anytime you type restart on your console or quit on your console, it's automatically going to restart your server no matter what, because we have this restart loop built in. I suggest that you have this in here, but just so that you understand that when you try to shut down your server and it automatically restarts, it's because of these 3 lines right here, which is also incredibly helpful to have, so that if your server accidentally crashes or whatever, it could potentially restart on its own, providing that the console hasn't closed. I know I'm talking about things that you guys haven't actually seen yet because you haven't seen a server up and running, but if you're coming back to this video to refresh yourself, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Line number 3 is talking directly to SteamCMD, or at least we're going to make it talk to SteamCMD. What this line is doing is basically anytime you run this batch file, we're going to check with Facepunch and Steam to see if there's a Rust update. If there is a Rust update that's required for your server, it's automatically going to run it, but we need to tell it how to actually do that. So as you can see there, the default address location for SteamCMD.exe is not right in comparison to what we've now created on our system. So let's go back to where SteamCMD is actually located on our system. So we go back into our SteamCMD folder and we've got SteamCMD.exe right here. Perfect. That's exactly where we want it to be. Let's grab this address location right here and we're just going to put that on our clipboard. So Control C or right click and then copy. And then we can go back to our batch file editor. So now we've got this address right here. We're going to highlight the address that's wrong and we're going to Control V or paste in the correct address. So now you'll notice that my address location is Rust 2021, SteamCMD, SteamCMD, and then SteamCMD.exe. It's very important that you get that final section in there. If you were to just copy your address and paste it directly into your batch file, you would be missing out on the SteamCMD.exe. I'm emphasizing this because I've seen this happen on multiple occasions. People just copy that line from their address location and paste it in there, and then they forget to actually call on the executable file called SteamCMD.exe. Wow, that was a mouthful. So now that we've successfully called on SteamCMD, what do we want it to do? Well, we're going to log in anonymously again, which is this line right here. After it is successfully logged in anonymously, what do we want it to do? We want it to check for an update and of course install that update if there is one. But as you can see here, this address is wrong as well. Now we need to go get the actual address of the folder where our Rust server is residing. So same thing, let's go back to our folder. Let's go back one more and then we'll go into Rust folder and we're just going to copy this entire address right there in the top address bar. And we can go back to our editor and we can just highlight the address that is wrong and then we can press Control V or paste in the actual address. So now you can see the line now reads force install dir C drive Rust 2021 Rust server. So now we know that it's actually going to install that update to the actual address that we're telling it to. So now that we know where it's actually installing it, we need to tell it what to install. And that of course is this line right here, which is app update 258550. Once we're done with all of that, you basically never have to touch this line ever again. Just know that every time you run this batch file, which means every time you run your server, it's automatically going to check Facepunch for an update. And if there is one, it's going to automatically install it. Starting at line 4 is where the server specific stuff comes in. So where we're going to name our server, how big is it going to be, how many players are we going to allow on our server, etc., etc. All that information starts on line 4. But line 4 is really long if you just copied and pasted it from my video description. So what I like to do is I like to reorganize it a little bit so that it makes more sense and it's definitely easier to read and certainly easier to find if there's a problem. So what I like to do is go through and break up each line individually. However, it's important to recognize that we have to follow a certain syntax in order for this batch file to function correctly. So at the end of each line that we want to break up, we want to put what's called a caret or shift 6 on most keyboards. And it looks like a little hat thing. And then we can hit enter and it drops the line down to the next line. And we can keep doing this behind each one of the plus signs until our batch file now looks like this. As you can see, definitely easier to read, definitely easier to find problems, and definitely easier to find things that you need to change each time you wipe your server. All right, so let's go into some of the specifics of our batch file. So server port is just simply defining which port on your computer your server is going to be operating out of. The same thing can be said about your Archon port. Which port on your computer do you want your Archon to be able to access to be able to control your server? Don't worry, we're going to get an Archon information on another video. You'll see here I have server level procedural map selected. Now, if you wanted to run a Baron map, you would change this to Baron. If you wanted to run Happus Island, you would change this to Happus Island. You don't necessarily need to have this on there, but for testing purposes, we're going to leave it in place because we are actually using a procedurally generated map. So server seed is essentially which island do we actually want our server to be generated on. If you would like to pick a specific map seed that you want your server to generate, you can go to playrust.io and you can pick from literally thousands of different seeds. So right here at server seed, we can change this to whatever seed that we decided to pick from on playrust.io. I'm just going to leave this number as random. I literally just keyboard smashed and this is the number that came out. Server world size is 4,500. Like I said, that's the default size. You can make it smaller, you can make it bigger, up to the size of 6,500. Server max player, what's the maximum number of players that we want to be able to have on our server? You can literally put this number to whatever it is you want it to be, up to a maximum of 500. I think 500 is the maximum number of player slots that you can have on any server. Your server host name, this is the name of the server, how it's going to appear when you go into the actual game directory and search for different servers. And then of course down below that is a server description. So in the box that pops up when somebody clicks on your server, the information that's in the box down below your server title, that is your server description. Server.url, that is the website that's associated with your service. So if you have a website designed that you want your players to be able to have access to, when they hit escape while they're in game, there's a button that pops up there called view web page. If you want them to be directed to your web page, you would put that address on the server.url line. If you don't have a website, maybe you just want people to connect directly to your Discord or something like that, put your Discord invite link there instead of a website address. And when they click on view website, it'll then take them to your Discord link instead. Server header image is that picture that shows up when you click on a server from the directory. It's the image that shows up there. Most people just leave theirs at default. I highly suggest that you have a custom built, creative looking, something that's going to grab your players' attention and make them want to join your server. I actually have a video on how to create header images. I'll put a link to that in the top right hand corner right now. The server identity is a way for you to identify your server on the computer that you're working on right now. This name that you're seeing right here, the 2021 test server, nobody in the world is going to see that except for people that have access to the actual file side of your server. You're going to see what I mean in just a couple minutes once we run this batch file. If you're going to be running an Archon or some sort of remote console system for your server, you're going to want to define a password in order to access that remote console. And you can do that right here with archon.password and put in whatever password you want there in order to be able to access the remote Archon. If you are going to be using a remote Archon, I highly suggest that you put in this web Archon 1. There's a very long and drawn out explanation why this should be here. However, the option for the alternative is going to be going away relatively soon. So just trust me, just put web Archon 1 if you want to be able to have some sort of remote console access. Like I said before, I'm going to get into the Archon aspect of things on a future video. So if you're unsure right now what that is, stay tuned. You're going to see it very, very shortly. And once we're satisfied with how our batch file is all set up, if we think that everything is done correctly, we can save and close this file, and then we could run the executable and actually run the server. There's a couple of things that I want to go over before we get into all of that though. One of the mistakes that I see a lot of people do when they've taken the copy paste version of the batch file that I provide in the video description down below, and they paste it into their Notepad++, and then they try to modify it so that it looks similar to this. What ends up happening is you could end up with what I call a ghost space at the end of one of these lines. So can you guys see that? So this is essentially what it looks like right here. So after this caret that we've now added to our batch file, if we accidentally leave a space right there, basically that batch file is going to stop working at that point and basically ignore everything that's after it. So if you're finding that your batch file is running to a certain point, let's say that it's running the map seed correctly and the map size correctly, but it isn't acknowledging your player count correctly or player slot correctly, it could be because you have a ghost space somewhere inside of your batch file. And it's actually funny, now that I'm talking about this, I realized that when I copied this from the random website that I got it from, I noticed that they actually had a built-in ghost space on the batch file directly from the reputable place that I got the batch file template from. It's almost like they set it up so that people would fail if they tried to use that batch file template. I've actually fixed it, so if you are grabbing it from the video description down below, that error has been fixed. But just know that if you're going to change your format to similar to what I've got going on right now, be careful when you're adding in your carets so that you're not accidentally adding any ghost spaces. And if you are finding that there's a problem with your batch file, go back and search for those ghost spaces. It can be after or before the caret. It's going to create an error and your batch file is going to stop running correctly at that point. So if we added one right there, as well as after, everything after that line would be ignored. So just make sure your spacing and your syntax is done correctly, and this batch file should run exactly how I'm expecting it to. So we're just going to click on save. We're going to close Notepad++, and now we're going to run our Rust server startup file. So as you can see there, the first thing it did is it logged in anonymously. Now it's checking for an app update from Facepunch. There wasn't one because we just did this. And then it's going to go ahead and run our server. You also might get this Windows security alert pop up. You just want to allow this to go through. So allow access. Basically what that's doing is asking if it's okay that we open up the port on your Windows firewall in order to allow access to your server. Is that port forwarding? No, I'll get into that in just a minute. Once your batch file is successfully running, you're going to see it do a whole bunch of different things, asset warm-ups, a whole bunch of things that aren't going to make any sense. There are a couple of things that I want you to pay attention to, and I'll try to make a note of them as they pass by here in a couple of seconds. So this is the first error that's going to pop up that you're going to notice. That's okay. The first time you run your server or the first time you run a new map on your server, you're going to see this yellow error here. It's just telling you that it's creating that map file because there wasn't one there before. And that's okay. You're going to see that. Basically, any of the errors that you might see running across your screen, as long as they're not red, you don't really have to worry about them. So once it's all finished, it's going to say Steam server connected. It's going to say Bradley APC spawned at location. In theory, you're going to have a launch site, but you might not necessarily. If you don't have a launch site, it's not going to say Bradley spawned. Don't worry about that. But the important details that you want to absolutely make sure are correct are your server name and your player slots, and that your map size is correct and that it loaded the correct map seed. If that all looks good, congratulations, you now have a Rust server up and running. So of course, the first thing that we're going to want to do once we have our server up and running is of course, log into that server. So if you're running this server on a locally hosted machine, which is what I've now shown you how to do, you're going to go into your Rust game like you normally would, but instead of clicking on play game, you're going to press F1, which brings up your Rust game console. Now, once in here, we're going to do client.connect, localhost, and then the port number. Now, using this command is only going to work if you're playing on the same machine that you're hosting on. If you're hosting the server on a different computer, but still on your same network, you have to actually use that computer's IP address. You won't be able to use the local host like I'm showing you right now. So because I'm hosting this server on a different computer than the one that I'm actually playing on right now, I have to use the IP address of that actual machine. All right, so as you can see, here we are on the server that we have now just created. And if we switch back to the console view, you can now see that I've just connected from my IP address, blah, 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 blah. It shows that I've now connected to the server that we've just created. So now once you're actually in your own server, the first thing that you're gonna wanna do, and I know that every single one of you wants to do it, is you wanna go into your F1 menu, you wanna click on items, and you want to spawn yourself an AK. Well, as we well know, you can't just do that right out of the box. There's some stuff that we have to do in order to make that happen. We essentially have to assign ourselves as the owner or the moderator of the server. So in order to do that, we go back to our console and we type owner ID space and then the Steam64 ID of the person that we want to assign as the owner or the moderator. After that, in quotes, we can assign a name to that so that we know who it is. And then after that, we can also assign a reason to that person. And you'll see exactly how this shows up in just a minute. Let me just finish with this first. So we click on enter. It's going to say added owner, my name, and then the Steam64 ID that's associated with that. Once we're done with that, we need to do write CFG to write that information to the configuration file. Here comes another problem that I see a lot of people run into. They'll do owner ID Steam64, but they won't do the write CFG after, therefore that information is not written to the configuration file. So what does that mean? That means anybody that you've assigned as an owner or a moderator, every time the server restarts, it's not going to be able to grab that information from the configuration file, and you'll have to redo those commands each time you restart your server. So if you do write CFG, it automatically writes it to the configuration file. Therefore, that information is saved every time the server restarts. So what is this configuration file that I speak of? Let's go back to our Rust server folder. Let's go into server. Let's go into the 2021 test server. Oh, by the way, in our batch file, you saw that I labeled my server identity as 2021 test server. That's how we get this, the name of this folder right here, is by putting in server identity on our batch file. So we can go in there, we can go into the CFG, and then we can go into the users.cfg. So if we open that up, you're going to now see the information that I have just written to the configuration file. The owner ID, this would be moderator ID if you selected moderator ID instead, the Steam64 ID, the name that we associated with that, and the reasoning that we associated with adding that owner or moderator. So if we go back in game again and we click on F1 console and we click on weapons again, now when I click on AK, it's still not giving me the AK. Well, why is that? After you've added an owner or a moderator to your Rust server, that person needs to log out and log back in order for the changes to take effect. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to show you in the console the differences between when a regular player joins versus when an owner or a moderator joins your server. So I just clicked on disconnect on my game, and you would think that you would be able to just click on retry connection. However, because we're using the client.connect command, we can't do that. If you do click on this retry connection, it's not actually going to reconnect you back to your your server. So what you want to do is you want to go back to your F1 console and you can just click up arrow and it'll bring up your previously used command and we can just run that again. So as you can see there, the differences from the way it looked before versus how it looks now. As you can see on my console, it shows me disconnecting from the server and then reconnecting right there. But as well as it showing that I have reconnected, it also says that I have auth level 2, which means I'm an owner of this server. Okay, so now that we've logged back in, let's go over to our items menu. And sure enough, when I click on give me an AK, it gives me an AK. And here we go. Now I have an AK. So yes, you can spawn items in from the menu. Yes, it's going to show in chat that you've spawned things in. So be very careful with that. If you do have other players on there, they're not going to be happy with the fact that you're able to spawn things in and they aren't. And what's the first thing that people do when they're unhappy with a server? They leave and they never come back. So if you're looking to populate your server, don't do this. Don't spawn items in, not for you, not for friends, not for anybody. Don't spawn items in. It's just not worth it. When players see you doing that, they're going to leave. They're never going to come back. So other than spawning items in, what are some other useful commands that we can use as an owner or moderator of a server? Well, of course, we can fly, we can use God mode, and we can use a command called end kill, which basically destroys whatever it is that you're looking at. So you're looking at this tree right here, and let's say you wanted it to disappear or whatever it is that you're looking at. It could be a node, it could be a bear, it could be a part of a base, whatever. If you want it to disappear, you go into your F1 console and you type ent space kill, just like that, and then of course that tree disappears. Now of course I suggest you bind that command to a key. That way you can just walk up to whatever item you want to delete and hit that key on your keyboard and it kills that item. Like I said, you can do this to anything that is farmable. You can do this to bases. You can do this to animals, NPCs, junk piles, anything you want. Anything you want to make disappear, just end kill it. So how do we bind commands to keys? Very simply, go into your F1 console and type bind, and then whatever key it is that you want to bind that command to. In my case, I use K. So bind K end kill. That of course binds that command to the K key so that anytime I hit that key and I'm looking at something, it end kills that item. Another thing that people like doing once they own their own server is being able to fly. In order to fly, that command is no clip. So you can just go into your F1 console again and type no clip with no space, hit enter, and then now you're flying around and you can clip through everything and anything and basically do whatever you want. Same thing there. I would suggest that you bind that to a key so that you can quickly do it on the fly. In my case, I use my L key for no clipping. So I use bind L no clip, hit enter. Now anytime you hit L, you can be running along and hit L and all of a sudden you're no clipping and flying around. Another useful tool is the debug camera. Let's say you're trying to sneak up on a player, but you don't necessarily want your player character to be visible. What I would do then is just hide my player character, let's say under the map or whatever, and then go into our debug camera. So in order to do that, you go into your F1 console and type debug camera. That then releases your camera away from your character. As you can see there, there's my character, and I can now fly around as a camera looking for whatever it is that I feel that I need to be looking for. Of course, same as everything else, you want to bind that to a key. In order to do that, in my case, I use the letter P on my keyboard in order to activate debug camera. So bind P debug camera is the command in order to bind your debug camera to the letter P. You can of course change that key to whatever it is that you want it to be. Just don't utilize a key that is typically used for something else. So that's basically it. Essentially, you have now created your very own Rust server. I've showed you how to log into it. I've shown you how to give yourself owner ID or moderator ID. And I've shown you a couple of basic commands that I utilize on a daily basis when operating my servers. So just a couple of details that I get a lot of questions about. First of all, the Amsterdam II thing. If you hit escape and look at what server it is that you're connected to, you're going to see it say Amsterdam II, procedural map, a random number out of player slots 500. This of course is not the information that we have running in our batch file. That's okay. Even though you see all of this information and it looks completely wrong, you are actually connected to your server. The reason why this happens is because we're using the client.connect command and connecting to a server locally. If you'd like to make it so that when you connect to your server, it actually looks like your server, you have your header image, your title, and your description, check out this video in the top right hand corner right now. I tell you exactly how to make that happen for you. But just know that as long as your port forwarding is done correctly, when a player from outside your network tries to connect to your server, they're going to see what you're intending them to see. They're not going to see this Amsterdam II thing and this gibberish of a description. Another Another common issue that I see a lot of people having is they're complaining that their players keep getting kicked for player tick. So what can cause that, and you've probably seen me talking about this if you've been around my channel for any length of time, is called stalling out your console. So as you can see right now, my console is running correctly. My cursor is sitting down at the bottom where I would expect it to be. But if we accidentally click somewhere on the console right here, and you can see it's indicated by this white box right here, technically from this point forward, my server is now stalled. So players might be moving around inside my server, but they can't actually pick up items, they can't chop down trees, they can't access inventory, they can't do anything, but they can still freely move around. And then after a while, it's going to say kicking players for player tick, and it's simply because you've stalled out your server. So in order to prevent that from happening, anytime you're doing any kind of work with your console, just make sure you hit enter a couple of times as you're leaving your console. Oh, see, it just happened there. So it actually kicked me out of my own server because I had my server stalled for too long while I was explaining to you guys what was going on. And this, of course, is what it looks like from the player side of it. So if you're getting players complaining that they keep getting kicked for packet flooding, that's probably the reasoning for it. If that's not happening and you're still having players kicked for this reason, chances are pretty good that whatever computer is running your server doesn't have a good enough internet connection, and you may end up with the same results. After you've removed the stall from your console, of course, your regular players that aren't on your network would be able to click on this green button right here saying retry connection, but anybody that is on your local network will have to run the client.connect command again, simply by going into your F1 console again and scrolling up on your arrow pad until you get to the command that says client connect. Of course, then it reconnects us back to our server, just like we would expect. So just make sure you haven't accidentally stalled out your console, and that will prevent that from happening. All right, so that basically sums it up. That's how you start your very own vanilla Rust server on a local host type of scenario. Yes, there are other options out there. However, this is a great way for you to start out to see if this is even something that interests you at all. It's a great way to get used to the back end of how servers are actually operated so that you can feel comfortable before you start spending money on a hosting provider. If you are considering going to a hosting provider, I suggest to you that you check out the guys over at icehost.com. Their website is listed in the video description down below. Should you decide to actually go to a paid hosting service, I suggest icehost.com. They are one of my partners. They have given me a promo code that does save you some money. It is also worth noting that you can try out a hosted server with icehost.com for free for 24 hours to see if they're the right fit for you. So make sure you check out my guys over at icehost.com. If you would like to help support me and my channel, of course, and become one of these people that you see running across my head right now, you can check me out at patreon.com/Srtbull. And of course, one of the easiest ways for you to support me is by simply smashing that like button for me. So if you found this video helpful in any way whatsoever, make sure you do hit that like button for me. And also, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them in the comment section down below. I do my very best to get to every single one of them. I put out a brand new video every Friday at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. So until then, stay safe, make sure you're taking care of each other, check in on your neighbors and your friends to make sure they're doing okay as well. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next Friday.